I still remember the exact moment everything went wrong because it started with something so small and ridiculous that I actually laughed at first, which is wild considering it ended with police cars blocking my driveway and my neighbors screaming in the mud, while a plumber calmly held up a length of cut pipe like it was evidence from a crime show, and the crazy part is that 10 minutes before all that I was standing in my kitchen holding an empty coffee mug wondering why my sink was making a choking noise like it was offended by water itself, and at that moment I had no idea my neighbor was literally underground stealing from me and lying about it with a straight face. So the day started normal enough. I woke up early planning to water my garden because it had been brutally hot all week and my plants were hanging on by pure spite. I turned the faucet, and instead of the usual strong flow I got a weak sad trickle that coughed and sputtered like it might die at any second, which immediately annoyed me because I pay my bills on time and I had just replaced part of my plumbing a few months earlier, so low pressure made no sense. I checked another faucet, same problem, then the shower, same thing, and now I was irritated but still calm because normal people assume boring explanations first. Maybe the city was doing work, maybe there was air in the line, maybe I was just unlucky. So I stepped outside to check the meter box, and that was when I noticed fresh dirt along the side of my yard. Not a lot, just enough to look wrong, like someone had carefully tried to make it look old and natural, except I know my yard, and I had not dug anything there, and right beyond that dirt line was my neighbor standing in his driveway pretending very hard to be busy with absolutely nothing, which should have been my first real warning sign, because this guy had a long history of pretending things were not happening while they were very clearly happening. Right in front of everyone. He was the kind of neighbor who complained about shadows, trees, noises, birds, and once even tried to tell me that rainwater flowing downhill onto his property was somehow my responsibility. So seeing him suddenly very interested in his mailbox while glancing at my yard made my stomach tighten a little, but I brushed it off and went back inside to call a plumber, because low pressure is annoying but not suspicious yet. The plumber I called was a local guy named Mike who had worked on my house before, and when I described the issue he asked a few questions that immediately made me pause. He asked if any neighbors had done recent digging. He asked if my pressure dropped suddenly or gradually, and when I mentioned the fresh dirt his tone changed from casual to alert, and he said he could be there in an hour and that I should not run any water until he arrived, which is not something you want to hear when you already feel like something is off. So I waited, pacing around the house, watching the clock and glancing out the window where my neighbor was now nowhere to be seen, which somehow made things worse. When Mike arrived, he went straight to the meter and confirmed what I was feeling, that the pressure drop was real and not a city issue. Then he walked the line path across my yard slowly like a detective following footprints, and stopped exactly where I had noticed the dirt. He crouched down, pressed the soil with his fingers, and looked up at me with a face that said, "This is going to be stupid and expensive," and asked me very calmly if I had given anyone permission to access my water line, which of course I had not, and that was the moment my annoyance officially turned into anger, because water lines are not decorations, they are buried for a reason, and touching them without permission is not a misunderstanding, it is a choice. Mike explained that my water line ran from the street across my property before branching toward my house, and that if someone tapped into it before the split it would affect my pressure exactly like this. And while he was explaining this, my neighbor suddenly appeared again, walking over with a forced smile and a voice dripping with fake concern, asking if everything was okay because he noticed the plumber truck, and this man had the nerve to look surprised when Mike asked him directly if he had done any digging near the line, and he immediately went defensive, saying he had no idea what we were talking about and that he would never touch someone else's property, and that maybe the plumber should check his own work, which was a bold move considering Mike had not even touched the ground yet. And at this point my heart was pounding because the pieces were clicking together too fast, and the neighbor energy shifted from fake friendly to hostile in seconds. He started complaining about his own water pressure, claiming it had been bad for weeks, and suggesting that my recent repairs must have affected the neighborhood, and that was when Mike said something that changed everything. He said that, if the neighbor pressure had improved recently instead of worsened, that would explain a lot, and the neighbor froze just for a split second, but it was enough, and I saw it, and Mike saw it, and suddenly the air felt heavy because innocent people do not freeze like that over plumbing conversation. Mike then told both of us that the only way to confirm the issue was to expose the line and see if there was an illegal connection, and before I could even respond, the neighbor snapped that no one was digging on his property without permission, which was hilarious considering we were talking about my yard and my line, and that reaction alone confirmed everything I needed to know, because now he was sweating and talking fast and accusing and threatening and saying words like lawsuit and harassment and property rights, all while standing on ground that was very clearly mine. And when Mike calmly said that if there was an illegal tap it would be a criminal matter, not a civil one, the neighbor laughed too loudly and said good luck proving it, and walked back to his house, slamming his door so hard a bird flew out of the tree above. And that was the exact moment I realized this was not just a neighbor dispute, this was theft and sabotage, and it was going to get ugly fast, and I had no idea yet just how ugly, because Chapter 1 of this mess was only just beginning, and somewhere underground my waterline was already telling the real story, waiting to be uncovered, whether my neighbor liked it or not.
By the next morning the situation had already grown teeth, because when I woke up the water pressure was worse, not better, and that meant whatever had been done underground was not accidental and not finished either, which sent my stress level straight through the roof, since water is not a luxury, it is basic survival, and the idea that someone felt entitled enough to mess with it made my skin crawl. I went outside again, and this time the disturbed soil looked different, like it had been lightly pressed down again overnight, and that was the moment my patience officially snapped, because no city crew works silently at night, and no mystery fixes itself by magic. So I called Mike back and told him flat out that I wanted the line exposed and documented properly, permits, inspections, photos, everything, because I was not about to let my neighbor gaslight his way out of this. And Mike agreed immediately, saying that the longer we waited, the worse it could get, because illegal taps often leak, and leaks destroy soil foundations and cause sinkholes. And suddenly this was not just about water pressure, it was about my house, my safety, and my money. When Mike arrived with another worker and proper equipment, my neighbor was already outside watching from his porch, pretending to scroll his phone, while very obviously listening to every word we said. And when the digging started, his behavior escalated fast. He shouted across the yard, asking what exactly we thought we were doing, and when I told him calmly that we were inspecting my private water line, he laughed and said that line ran under shared land, which was a lie. I had deeds, surveys, and markers to prove otherwise, and he knew it, but lies are easier when you say them loud enough. He then accused me of sabotaging his water on purpose, which was rich considering my faucets were barely functioning and his grass looked suspiciously green for someone supposedly suffering from low pressure. Mike stayed professional, marking the dig zone and explaining everything out loud as he worked, because plumbers know when they are about to become witnesses. And sure enough, it did not take long before the shovel hit something solid that should not have been there, and when the dirt was cleared away we all saw it, a secondary pipe clamped directly into my main line, running off toward my neighbor's yard. Clean new fittings, recent work, and definitely not legal. And the moment my neighbor saw it, his entire demeanor changed from smug to furious. He stormed over, yelling that this proved nothing, that it was probably old, that maybe the city installed it and forgot, which would have been hilarious if it was not so insulting, because the pipe material was modern and the clamps were brand new, still shiny with tool marks. Mike calmly pointed that out, and then did something that made my neighbor explode. He took photos from multiple angles showing the connection, the direction of flow, and the exact location relative to my property markers, and said very clearly that this was unauthorized access to a private utility line, and that by law he was required to report it if the responsible party refused to acknowledge it. My neighbor started pacing, swearing, saying everyone steals water, and that it was no big deal, and that I was being dramatic, which was incredible, because moments earlier he had been threatening lawsuits over imagined sabotage, and now that real evidence was staring him in the face, he suddenly wanted it to be no big deal. He then tried a new tactic saying he had kids and bills and that water was expensive, and that I should be neighborly and let it go like he had not just secretly tapped into my line, instead of asking like a normal human being, and when I said no he lost it completely, shouting that he would dig up the line himself and fix it, which made Mike step between us and tell him firmly to back away, because tampering further would only make things worse, and that was when the neighbor said the sentence that sealed his fate. He said, "Fine, call whoever you want, I know my rights, and I am not afraid of the police," and Mike looked at me, nodded once, and made the call, because plumbers do not bluff about things like this. While we waited, the neighbor retreated to his porch again, but this time he was making phone calls of his own, pacing, shouting, telling someone that he was being harassed and targeted, and that corrupt contractors were trying to frame him, and I stood there watching my water line exposed, feeling a mix of vindication and disbelief, because this whole mess could have been avoided with a simple conversation. But entitlement does not work that way. It works in secrecy and denial and tantrums. The police arrived faster than I expected, 2 officers, calm, professional, and clearly used to neighbor disputes that turn ugly, until they saw the pipe, and then their expressions changed from bored to serious very quickly. Mike explained what he found, showed them the photos, and pointed out the direction of the illegal connection, and one officer followed the line visually toward my neighbor's property, while the other asked my neighbor directly if he had installed it, and instead of denying it like a smart criminal, he went on a long rambling speech about unfair utility costs, and how the system was rigged, and how everyone cheats a little, which is not the defense you think it is when standing next to physical evidence buried in someone else's yard. The officers exchanged a look, and told him to stop talking, which he did not do, and then they informed him that unauthorized tapping of a private water line constituted theft of services and property damage, and that the situation would now be handled formally, including documentation, fines, and potential charges. And when they told him he would need to shut off and remove the illegal connection immediately under supervision, he finally went quiet, pale, and shaking, and for the first time since this started he looked scared, not angry, not smug, but scared, because reality had finally caught up to him. And as Mike capped my line properly and restored my pressure, I turned on the hose and watched clear, strong water surge out like a victory lap, knowing that this was only chapter 2 and that the consequences were just beginning to flow. The fallout did not end when the police left, because that was when the neighbor shifted from denial to revenge mode and decided that if he was going down he was going to make as much noise as possible on the way, and within 24 hours I started getting notices taped to my door about alleged code violations ranging from improper hose storage to imaginary runoff issues that somehow only existed on paper, and it was painfully obvious where they were coming from, because the complaints were written in the same dramatic tone he used when yelling across the fence, complete with exaggerated language and wild accusations. And while it would have been funny under different circumstances, it was exhausting, because suddenly my peaceful routine had been replaced with inspectors knocking on my door, and me having to explain over and over that no, I was not flooding his yard, and no, my water pressure issue was not part of a secret scheme to bankrupt him. The city inspector who showed up first was professional and clearly unimpressed by the complaint list, and when I showed him the police report number and the documentation Mike had provided, his expression softened, and he actually apologized for the inconvenience, and said quietly that once someone is flagged for utility theft, they often try to retaliate through the complaint system because they think it gives them leverage. And hearing that made something click in my head, because this was not just about water anymore, this was about control. My neighbor could not stand the fact that he had been exposed and corrected, and so he was lashing out in every way he could think of, legal or not. That afternoon I noticed him standing at the edge of his property filming my house with his phone, narrating loudly about how he was gathering evidence, which would have been intimidating if it was not so ridiculous, because the only thing he was capturing was me standing there holding a stack of paperwork, looking tired and annoyed, but still he kept at A pacing pointing whisper yelling like he was auditioning for a courtroom drama, and that night he escalated again by shutting off his main valve, and then calling the city to report a neighborhood-wide outage claiming my illegal plumbing had damaged the system, which resulted in a utility crew showing up at 10 at night knocking on my door, while my neighbor watched from his porch with a smug smile that vanished the moment the crew supervisor recognized the address and said, "Oh, this is the water theft case," and immediately redirected all questions toward him instead of me because records matter and his name was already flagged in the system, and watching that shift happen in real time was oddly satisfying because he tried to backtrack, stutter, joke, anything to regain control, but the professionals were not interested in theatrics, they were interested in facts, and facts were not on his side. The supervisor explained calmly that any further false reports could result in penalties and that his account was now under review pending resolution of the theft investigation, and that was when he snapped again, accusing everyone of being against him, claiming conspiracies and favoritism, while the rest of us just stood there tired and ready for this to be over. The next few days brought more developments, including a formal notice stating that he was responsible for the cost of repairing my line, the inspection fees, and a fine for unauthorized connection, and when he received it he marched over to my yard waving the paper, shouting that I had ruined his life and demanding that I pay half because neighbors help neighbors, and the irony of that statement almost knocked the wind out of me because helping neighbors does not include secretly digging into their utilities and stealing resources, and when I told him to leave my property he refused until I reminded him that there were now multiple reports documenting his behavior and that he was already on thin ice, and that finally made him retreat, muttering threats under his breath that I documented immediately because by this point I was not taking chances, and that turned out to be a smart move because 2 days later someone cut my garden hose clean through, and while I could not prove it was him, the timing was suspicious, and the officer who took my report raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the ongoing dispute and added it to the file because patterns matter and retaliation has a way of stacking up against the person doing it. Meanwhile, Mike returned to finish the permanent repairs and walked me through everything, explaining how the illegal tap had reduced pressure, increased risk of contamination, and could have caused serious damage long term, and hearing that made me realize how close I had come to real disaster just because one entitled person decided rules did not apply to him when the repairs were complete and my system was fully restored. The difference was dramatic: strong pressure, steady flow, and peace of mind, and I stood there watching the water run, feeling both relieved and angry because none of this should have happened, and yet it did, simply because someone thought they were smarter than everyone else. But the real turning point came when a plain envelope arrived addressed to both of us, informing us of a mandatory mediation hearing regarding the dispute and damages, and while part of me dreaded it, another part of me welcomed the chance to put everything on record in a formal setting because at this point the truth was so well documented it was practically laminated, and when the day came my neighbor showed up late, visibly irritated, and immediately started arguing with the mediator before we even sat down, which did not help his case at all, and as evidence was presented, photos, reports, timelines, statements, his posture slowly collapsed from aggressive to defensive to resigned, and when the mediator explained that continued escalation could lead to civil judgments beyond the initial fines, something in him finally cracked because he stopped interrupting, stopped posturing, and just stared at the table, and for the first time, he looked less like an entitled bully and more like someone realizing that their actions had real, irreversible consequences. And as the session ended with clear directives and warnings, I walked out knowing that Chapter 3 had ended not with a dramatic explosion, but with something far more powerful: accountability settling in like concrete, hard and impossible to ignore. And while I knew the story was not over yet, I also knew the balance had shifted permanently, and that no amount of shouting could undo what had already been exposed underground and on record. shifted from loud chaos to quiet pressure, the kind that sits on your chest even when nothing is happening, because after mediation my neighbor went strangely silent. No yelling, no fake complaints, no dramatic performances, just closed blinds, slow movements, and a feeling like something was brewing under the surface, and that silence worried me more than his tantrums ever had, because people like him do not suddenly accept consequences. They regroup, and sure enough it started with a certified letter delivered one afternoon stating that he intended to sue me for damages, emotional distress, harassment, and loss of water access, which would have been laughable if it had not been real paper with a real stamp and his real signature. And for a moment I felt that familiar doubt creep in, the exhausting thought of, do I really want to deal with this longer? But then I remembered the pipe in the ground, the photos, the police report, the inspector notes, and the mediation summary, and that doubt evaporated. Because facts are stubborn things and they do not disappear just because someone is angry. I contacted a local attorney recommended by Mike, who specialized in property and utility disputes, and when I laid out the entire timeline she actually shook her head and smiled in disbelief, because according to her cases this clean almost never come along, and she explained that not only did his claim have no standing but that his actions opened him up to counterclaims if he continued to harass me. And hearing that felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, because up until then I had been reacting, constantly responding, documenting, defending, and now, for the first time, I felt like I could stand still and let the process work. The next escalation came faster than expected, when a city engineer contacted me requesting access to my property for a follow-up inspection tied to the water theft case, and when he arrived with his equipment and maps my neighbor came storming out again, demanding to know why more people were involved and accusing me of dragging things out unnecessarily, and the engineer calmly informed him that due to the illegal tap, there was concern about potential backflow contamination affecting nearby lines, which meant the city had to verify system integrity, and that sentence wiped the color from his face, because contamination is not just a fine issue, it is a serious public health violation. And suddenly his earlier attempts to minimize everything as no big deal came crashing down, because now the consequences were expanding beyond just us. The engineer tested, pressure-checked valves, reviewed installation dates, and confirmed that my line was clean, but noted that the illegal connection had bypassed safeguards entirely, and that documentation was added to the case file. And while the engineer packed up, he told my neighbor directly that if contamination had occurred the penalties would have been far more severe, and that he was lucky, which is not a word entitled people like to hear when they are used to thinking luck is something they deserve, not something they narrowly escape. After that visit the tone of the entire situation changed, because neighbors started noticing the official vehicles, the inspections, the quiet arguments, and word spread quickly in a way that small communities excel at, and suddenly the narrative was no longer his version whispered over fences, it was a shared understanding that he had been caught stealing water and lying about it, and that kind of social consequence hits harder than fines ever could. People stopped engaging with him, casual greetings disappeared, invitations dried up, and he seemed to shrink inside his property, moving quickly, avoiding eye contact. And while I did not take pleasure in his isolation, I did feel relief, because the pressure was no longer aimed entirely at me. But he was not done yet, because one evening, just as I was settling in, I noticed my outdoor lights flicker and then shut off completely, and when I checked the breaker it had been flipped, and while breakers can trip, this one had been manually switched, and that realization sent a cold wave through me, because now utilities were being touched again, and this time it was electrical. I reported it immediately, and while there was no direct proof, the officer noted the ongoing dispute and advised me to install cameras, which I did the very next day, covering my yard, the meter boxes, and the line path, not because I wanted to escalate but because I wanted peace, and documentation is how peace is protected. The cameras went up quietly, and within 48 hours they paid for themselves, because one night around 2 in the morning my neighbor was caught on video creeping along the property line, holding a flashlight, scanning the ground near where the water line had been exposed earlier. He did not cross fully onto my yard, but he got close enough to make his intent clear, and the footage was clear: his face, his clothes, his movements. And when I Turned that video over to my attorney and the police. It added a new layer to the case: attempted interference and intimidation, and that was the moment the balance tipped completely, because now there was digital evidence to match the physical, and professional documentation and patterns started forming that were impossible to ignore. The next official response came in the form of a notice ordering him to cease any contact with my utilities or property and warning that further incidents could result in charges. And when that notice arrived, his reaction was not explosive, it was defeated. He stood in his driveway staring at the paper for a long time, then folded it carefully and went inside, and for days nothing happened: no movement, no noise, no calls. And while that quiet should have been comforting, it felt eerie, like the calm after a storm where you are not sure if it is truly over or just paused. But then something unexpected happened. The city resolved the case, formally issuing final fines, repair cost reimbursement, and a written determination that the illegal tap had been intentional and unauthorized. And that determination mattered because it closed the loop officially. And when my attorney received confirmation, she told me that his lawsuit threat would go nowhere, and that any attempt to proceed would likely backfire financially for him. And hearing that allowed me to finally breathe deeply for the first time in weeks, because Chapter 4 did not end with shouting or police lights, but with something far more powerful: a system doing exactly what it was supposed to do when someone thinks rules do not apply to them. And while I knew there were still emotional ripples ahead, the foundation had shifted permanently, and this time it was not my waterline that was under pressure, but the person who tried to steal it. Unfolded, the conflict had moved out of the open and into the uncomfortable space where consequences begin to hurt in ways that cannot be argued away, because the official determinations were now in place, and my neighbor could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding or a personal grudge. And instead of shouting across the fence, he started showing up in places where paperwork matters: offices, banks, utility counters, anywhere. He thought he could undo the damage by sheer persistence and attitude. And each attempt failed quietly and thoroughly, because once something is documented, it does not care how loudly someone complains. And I found out about most of these failed attempts not from him but from the ripple effects, like receiving confirmation letters stating that funds had been credited back to my account for repairs and inspection costs, or notices clarifying that my property was fully compliant and cleared of any wrongdoing, while his account remained under review and frozen from any modifications until fines were paid in full. And that was when the financial pressure began to show, because his yard started to change. The perfectly watered lawn went dull, the sprinklers stayed silent, and the small construction projects he had bragged about before stopped halfway through, leaving exposed wood and plastic tarps flapping in the wind. And none of that would have mattered to me, except that he started blaming me for it openly again, telling anyone who would listen that I had ruined him, that I had connections, that I had manipulated the system. And while that narrative might have worked before, now it fell flat, because people had seen the inspectors, the police, the crews, and they knew what had happened, even if they did not know every detail. And social isolation settled around him like a fog, while at the same time my own routine slowly returned to normal. Water flowed, pressure was steady, repairs were complete, and for the first time in weeks I slept through the night without checking cameras or jumping at every sound. But peace does not always arrive cleanly, and just when things seemed to be stabilizing, I received notice of a scheduled civil compliance hearing requested by the city, not because I had done anything wrong, but because they wanted final confirmation on property boundaries and utility easements tied to the theft case, which meant more maps, more measurements, and more official presence. And when that day came, my neighbor arrived looking smaller than I had ever seen him, clutching a folder stuffed with papers like volume could replace substance. And throughout the hearing he tried repeatedly to redirect blame, arguing that water lines should be shared, that modern neighborhoods require flexibility, that fairness demanded cooperation. And each time he spoke, the official calmly redirected him back to the facts: property lines, documented ownership, unauthorized access, and intentional modification. And watching that exchange was surreal, because it stripped away all the emotional noise and left only the core truth that he had crossed a line literally and figuratively, and when the final statement was read confirming full responsibility assigned to him, and closing the case with compliance conditions attached, something in him seemed to deflate entirely, because there was no appeal, no negotiation, no next angle to try, just acceptance whether he wanted it or not. And after that, hearing something unexpected happened. He stopped looking at me altogether, not out of anger, but avoidance, and while that might sound like a relief, it carried its own weight, because avoidance is the behavior of someone who knows they were wrong but cannot admit it, and that silence lingered heavy and unresolved until one afternoon weeks later, when he finally approached me, not yelling, not threatening, but awkward, hesitant, and visibly uncomfortable, and he said quietly that he needed to talk, and every instinct told me to walk away, but curiosity and closure held me in place, and what followed was not an apology, not really, but a rambling explanation about financial stress, rising costs, poor decisions, and feeling trapped, and while none of that excused what he had done, it did explain how entitlement often grows from fear mixed with pride, and I listened without interrupting, because sometimes letting someone speak is the fastest way to end a chapter, and when he finished he asked if there was any way we could put everything behind us, and my response was simple and calm, that the situation was already resolved by the system, and that peace moving forward depended on boundaries being respected, not words, and he nodded like someone who finally understood a rule he could not bend, and walked away, and that was the moment Chapter 5 truly ended, not with triumph or revenge, but with the quiet understanding that consequences do not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive slowly through financial strain, social distance, and permanent knowledge that you were caught and could not talk your way out. And as I stood there watching my garden soak evenly under restored pressure, I realized that while the waterline had been the battleground, the real conflict had always been about entitlement meeting reality, and in this chapter reality had won without raising its voice. But that quiet carried a strange tension, because even though the official case was closed, the consequences were still moving through the background like slow gears grinding, and I started noticing changes that told me my neighbor was dealing with a reality he could no longer escape. Utility workers returned not for me, but for him, replacing meters, inspecting connections, and documenting compliance, and every visit reminded him and everyone else of what he had done, and while I kept my distance, I could see the strain settling into his posture, the way he moved less confidently, avoided eye contact, and no longer tried to dominate shared spaces like the sidewalk or driveway. And it was during this phase that the true cost of his actions became visible, because fines are one thing but ongoing oversight is another entirely, and his property was now flagged for periodic checks, which meant no shortcuts, no quiet fixes, and no bending rules without immediate consequences, and that pressure built, especially for someone who built their identity around getting away with things. And meanwhile my own life was settling back into normal routines, watering schedules, morning showers that actually felt refreshing, and the small comforts that come from having a basic utility function the way it should. And it was during one of those ordinary moments that I realized how deeply the conflict had affected me, because I caught myself waiting for something to go wrong even when nothing did, and it took effort to remind myself that I was not responsible for managing his behavior anymore. The system was, and that realization was freeing but also unsettling, because it meant letting go of the adrenaline that had fueled me through weeks of conflict and documentation and late-night camera checks. And as that adrenaline faded, something else surfaced, a mix of exhaustion and clarity, because I could finally see the situation from a distance, and what I saw was not a villain and a hero, but a cautionary tale of entitlement colliding with accountability. And while that does not excuse what he did, it explained why it unraveled the way it did. Entitlement does not adapt, it escalates until it breaks, and in his case it broke publicly and thoroughly. That realization became even clearer when a mutual acquaintance mentioned casually that my neighbor was struggling to refinance his home because the unresolved fines and flagged utility violations had complicated his paperwork. And while I did not feel satisfaction at his difficulty, I did feel confirmation that actions ripple outward in ways people rarely consider when they think rules are optional, and those ripples were now touching his finances, his reputation, and his sense of control all at once. And still he tried one last subtle maneuver, sending a note through the homeowners association suggesting a policy change that would allow shared access to underground utilities, framed as a community improvement, but everyone saw through it immediately because context matters, and the proposal was quietly shelved without discussion, which might have hurt more than a public rejection, because it showed that his influence had evaporated entirely. And around that time the plumber Mike stopped by unexpectedly, not for work, but to check in, and he laughed, saying he had never seen a case escalate the way ours had, because most people back down once evidence surfaces, but some people double down until the ground collapses under them. And he said something that stuck with me, that water lines are invisible until they are not, and entitlement works the same way. It hides underground until pressure exposes it, and that metaphor summed up the entire experience perfectly, because nothing about my neighbor had changed overnight. It had always been there, buried under politeness and complaints and assumptions of privilege, and it only surfaced when he decided to take something that was not his. And that understanding brought a strange sense of closure, because it reframed the conflict as inevitable, not personal. And as the weeks passed, his presence became quieter still. No more prowling, no more muttering, just a man living inside the limits he could no longer ignore. And one evening I saw him outside working on his yard, carefully, slowly following rules and permits posted clearly on a stake, and for a moment our eyes met, and there was no anger there, just resignation and something like understanding, and we nodded at each other, not as friends but as neighbors who had reached a boundary and agreed silently to stay on their own sides. And that moment mattered because it marked the transition from conflict to coexistence, and coexistence does not require forgiveness or friendship, it requires respect and restraint. And that was finally happening, not because he chose it willingly, but because he had no other option. And that is sometimes how peace arrives, not as a mutual agreement but as a consequence enforced long enough to become habit. And as Chapter 6 came to a close, I realized that the police call, the inspections, the fines, and the documentation had done more than protect my water line. They had reset the balance of power in a way that shouting and arguing never could, and that balance created space for normal life to resume, not perfectly, not without scars, but steadily and predictably. And that predictability was something I would never take for granted again, because when someone tries to steal what runs beneath your feet, they are not just taking water, they are testing boundaries, and once those boundaries are defended properly, they tend to hold confrontation and into reflection. But reflection did not mean calm, because when things finally slow down, the mind has space to replay everything, and I found myself revisiting moments I had pushed aside while dealing with the crisis: the initial disbelief, the anger, the fear of being blamed, and the exhaustion of constantly proving something that should never have needed proof. And it was during this quieter phase that I realized how deeply the situation had altered my sense of safety, because even though the practical threat was gone, the emotional residue lingered like a shadow, and small things would trigger it: the sound of digging from a nearby yard, a utility truck slowing down on the street, a knock at the door after dark. And I had to consciously remind myself that the danger had passed, and that the systems in place had worked. And that reminder was not weakness, it was recovery, and recovery is rarely dramatic, it is slow, repetitive, and sometimes frustrating. And as weeks turned into months, the neighborhood itself seemed to breathe again. Conversations returned to normal topics: weather, schedules, weekend plans, and the incident faded into background memory, spoken about less frequently and with less intensity. And while I appreciated the quiet, there was a strange discomfort in how quickly people moved on, because for me it had been a defining experience, one that reshaped how I understood trust, boundaries, and entitlement. And yet life around me flowed forward, indifferent to the lessons I had learned, and that disconnect forced me to process it internally rather than through shared outrage or validation, and during this time my neighbor remained distant, compliant, and subdued, no longer trying to assert dominance or control, just existing within the limits imposed on him, and that transformation was striking because it revealed how much of his previous behavior had been fueled by unchecked confidence rather than strength, and without that confidence he seemed smaller, less certain, and less capable of confrontation. And one afternoon I noticed him struggling to repair a fence section, and for a brief moment instinct told me to offer help, but I stopped myself, not out of spite but out of clarity, because part of maintaining boundaries is knowing when not to engage, and that realization felt like growth, not just for this situation, but for how I would approach conflict in the future, because not every wrong requires direct involvement. Sometimes the most powerful response is distance, supported by documentation and time, and as Chapter 7 continued to unfold I began sharing the experience selectively, not as gossip, but as caution, and each time I told the story it felt less heavy, less raw, and more structured, like something that had a beginning, middle, and an end, rather than an ongoing threat. And that narrative control mattered, because it allowed me to reclaim the experience on my terms rather than letting it define me through stress and anxiety, and the more I shared, the more I noticed a pattern. People were surprised not just by the theft but by how far it went before consequences arrived, and that surprise highlighted a broader truth about entitlement: it thrives in gaps where people assume decency and hesitate to escalate, and it made me realize that many similar situations likely go unresolved because the cost of confrontation feels higher than the cost of endurance, until suddenly it is not. And that insight stayed with me as I returned to my normal routines, because it changed how I evaluated small red flags in everyday interactions, not with paranoia but with awareness and preparedness. And near the end of this chapter something unexpected happened that brought a strange sense of closure. My neighbor moved out quietly, no announcement, no dramatic goodbye, just a for sale sign one week and an empty driveway the next, and while part of me wondered if the events had pushed him toward that decision, another part understood that sometimes leaving is easier than living with the weight of what you have done. And watching the moving truck pull away I felt a complex mix of relief, sadness, and finality, not because I wished him harm, but because his departure marked the true end of the conflict in a way that paperwork never could. And as new owners arrived, unaware of the history beneath the ground and the tension that once defined the space, I found myself hopeful that the lesson would persist even if the players changed, because the systems remained. The boundaries were reinforced, and the memory of what happened stayed with me as a quiet reminder of what vigilance looks like. And as Chapter 7 drew to a close I recognized that this phase was about integration, taking what happened and folding it into a stronger, clearer version of myself, not hardened, but informed, not suspicious, but prepared. And that preparation was not something I would ever regret, because it came at the cost of stress but delivered the gift of confidence, and that confidence was not loud or aggressive. It was steady, grounded, and rooted as deeply as the waterline that had started it all, now protected, visible, and respected exactly where it belonged. It felt less like an ending and more like a settling, as if the ground itself had finally compacted after weeks of disturbance, and everything above it was adjusting to a new normal. And that normal carried a quiet confidence that I had not known before, because the absence of conflict revealed how much energy it had consumed and how different life felt without constantly bracing for the next escalation. And as days passed without incident, I found myself enjoying simple routines again: washing dishes without listening for pressure changes, watering plants without checking meters, taking showers that were just showers instead of reminders of vulnerability. And in those ordinary moments the full weight of what had happened finally crystallized, because it was never really about water alone. It was about the assumption that someone else's resources, boundaries, and patience were available to be taken without consequence. And when that assumption was challenged, everything unraveled, and the unraveling was Loud, messy, and uncomfortable, but ultimately necessary, and as I reflected on the entire arc from the first sputtering faucet to police lights and inspections to silence and departure, I understood that the most powerful force in the story was not confrontation but consistency, the steady documentation, the calm refusal to be gaslit, the willingness to escalate through proper channels rather than personal retaliation, and that consistency had carried me through moments of doubt, anger, and exhaustion, and delivered something far more valuable than victory. It delivered peace that did not depend on intimidation or dominance but on clarity and enforcement, and that lesson stayed with me as the neighborhood slowly reset with new faces and fresh conversations, and while the physical traces of the conflict were gone, the memory remained not as bitterness but as a reference point, a reminder that entitlement often hides behind confidence, and that systems exist not to punish but to protect when used properly, and I found myself more willing to trust those systems, more willing to speak up early, and more willing to set boundaries clearly, because silence only serves those who benefit from it. And as I stood one evening watching the sun dip low across a yard that felt fully mine again, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently if I had ignored the signs or chosen to endure rather than act, and that realization brought a sense of gratitude, not just for the outcome but for the growth that came with it, because the experience had sharpened my awareness without dulling my empathy, and that balance felt important as I moved forward. And occasionally someone would ask about the story, having heard pieces of it through quiet channels, and I would tell it simply without drama, because the facts spoke for themselves, and the ending was always the same. The plumber called the police, the evidence held, and the line was protected, and people would nod, recognizing the deeper truth beneath the surface, that rules matter, boundaries matter, and entitlement collapses under scrutiny. And as the final chapter closed, I realized that the story did not end with my neighbor leaving or fines being paid. It ended with a shift in how I inhabited my own space, with confidence rather than caution, with awareness rather than anxiety, and with the knowledge that what runs beneath us, whether water lines or principles, must be guarded not aggressively but firmly, and when they are defended properly, they sustain everything above them quietly, reliably, and without drama. And that was the most satisfying resolution of all, because it meant the conflict had done its work, taught its lesson, and receded, leaving behind a stronger foundation than the one it had tried to exploit.